Hello, brothers and sisters. Thanks for joining me. Yesterday, I did a quick story about the UK not wanting to share intelligence with the US about boats in the Caribbean because they didn't want to be complicit in the US illegally sinking boats. Well, it looks like now the EU decided to scold the US about the very same thing. And Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, decided to give them a telling off. I really like Marco Rubio. I think he has a good chance of becoming president in the next few years. He just seems like he's good at his job of Secretary of State. So Rubio tells Europe they don't get to decide how the US defends itself. In the UK, the British Border Patrol seemed to welcome illegal border crossers in small boats with open arms. They actually will help them if they find them coming across and help them get to the United Kingdom, which I think is crazy. They should just turn them back. And so because Europe is so accommodating with these small boats and illegals, they really don't like it that the US and Trump take a different view on the matter. Trump blows them up. Now, he is blowing up boats that he's alleging are drug traffickers that he has classified as terrorists. So he's fighting the drug war the Donald Trump style. On November 10th, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth posted on X, at the direction of President Trump, two lethal kinetic strikes were conducted on vessels operated by designated terrorist organizations. These vessels were known by our intelligence to be associated with illicit narcotics smuggling. We're carrying narcotics and we're transitioning along a known narco trafficking transit route in the Eastern Pacific. Both strikes were conducted in international waters, and 3 male narco terrorists were aboard each vessel. All 6 were killed. No U.S. forces were harmed. Under President Trump, we are protecting the homeland and killing these cartel terrorists who wish to harm our country and its people. Yeah, so Trump is taking a strong stance against drugs. Part of his tariffs on Mexico and Canada had been related to him saying they're not doing enough to stop the influx of drugs into the US. And then now he's blowing up drug boats in the Pacific and in the Caribbean. And he's unapologetic about it. EU and UN officials decry President Trump's use of the military against narcos, but as usual, offer no alternative solution and refuse to condemn Latin American governments for allowing drugs to flow out of their countries and into the US and Europe. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, however, set them straight. The U.S. began deploying Navy warships and personnel to the Caribbean in mid-August as part of an anti-narco trafficking operation to stem the flow of drugs into the United States. President Trump announced on September 2nd that the Navy had carried out its first airstrike in the Caribbean on a boat from Venezuela, killing all 11 people on board. As of November 10th, at least 76 narcos have been killed in 19 strikes on 20 vessels in the Caribbean Sea and 10 in the Eastern Pacific. The UN Human Rights Chief, Volker Turk, condemned the strikes, saying they violate international law and amount to extrajudicial killings. He argued the U.S. has provided no evidence that anyone on the boats posed an imminent threat to life and urged Washington to stop the attacks and use law enforcement methods instead. Well, I would say, Chief Volker, if what the U.S. is doing illegal, then sanction the U.S. and sanction Trump in whatever venue you think is appropriate. I would say, as he hasn't been officially sanctioned by any court or international body, they really don't have a case. The CELAC EU summit in Colombia, EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas reminded leaders that force is lawful only in self-defense or with a UN mandate. Dutch Prime Minister Dick Schoof called for calm. Mexico's Juan Ramon de Fuente stressed sovereignty, and Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro, called the deaths extrajudicial executions and identified at least one Colombian victim. European Council President Antonio Costa urged dialogue over confrontation. The criticism is ironic given that Europe relies on America for its defense. Like I pretty much always say, the EU and the UK really don't get to tell the US how to use its military when the US is the guarantor of security for these places. Everyone knows that without the protection of the US, the rest of NATO really couldn't fight a sustained war against anyone. The British military only has somewhere on the order of 150,000 active duty troops. That would get chewed up no time in Ukraine. Mexico functions as a narco state where the president and other politicians operate at the mercy of the cartels, and Colombian officials have been heavily sanctioned by the United States for enabling narco traffic. In the past 2 years, Colombia saw staggering political violence with more than 34 politicians and candidates killed in the 24 election cycle alone. The previous year was described as the most violent on record for attacks on public officials. Yeah, so these drug cartels are really running Mexico and South American countries. And so why not use the military to stop them? As for Colombia, the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control sanctioned 4 Colombian nationals for their involvement in the global illicit drug trade. President Gustavo Petro, his wife, his son, and Interior Minister. So the Colombian president has been sanctioned as being involved with drugs. Great. At a press conference, Secretary of State Marco Rubio opened by rejecting foreign criticism of U.S. military operations. I don't think that the European Union gets to determine what international law is, he said. They certainly don't get to determine how the United States defends national security. Rubio emphasized that the U.S. is facing attacks from organized criminal and narco-terrorist groups in the Western Hemisphere, and that President Trump is acting to defend the country. Rubio noted what he called a double standard among U.S. allies. He pointed out that the European governments want Washington to supply nuclear-capable Tomahawk missiles to defend Europe, yet object when U.S. positions aircraft carriers in its own hemisphere. The secretary said the president's priority is clear. His job is to protect the United States from threats against the United States, and that's what he's doing in this operation. Addressing reports that Canada and UK are not sharing intelligence for the mission, Rubio said the United States has its own assets in the region and is acting on intelligence collected there. He would not discuss specifics, but dismissed a recent CNN report as false. It's a fake story, he said. Rubio criticized what he described as a recurring problem of low-level officials acting as anonymous sources despite being uninformed and having a hidden agenda. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. Maybe the UK is still intelligence sharing and that was just a false leak. Who knows? It's not like the US actually needs the UK or Canadians' help with this. Rubio stressed that the mission is a counter-drug operation ordered by the president in response to national security threats. He said the operation could end immediately if traffickers stopped sending drug boats toward the United States. He described the Maduro regime as a narco-terrorist regime already indicted in U.S. courts and as a transshipment hub that enables criminal groups to operate freely and ship drugs to the United States and Europe. Because Venezuelan authorities openly cooperate with the shipping of these drugs, Rubio said, European nations should be backing us. He closed by repeating that President Trump will continue defending U.S. national interests against terrorists and narco-trafficking organizations. So with that, let's actually watch what he said. I've got a quick clip here.
Well, let me ask you about that. She told me that they discussed the legality and that there are 2 reasons why an operation would be legal: self-defense and a UN resolution, that neither of those applied in this case, that they are all struggling with the drug issue, and that they should discuss whether international law needs to be updated. So let me ask you about that.
I don't think that the European Union gets to determine what international law is. They certainly don't get to determine is how the United States defends its national security. The United States is under attack from organized criminal narco-terrorists in our hemisphere, and the president is responding in the defense of our country. I do find it interesting that all these countries want us to send, and supply, for example, nuclear-capable Tomahawk missiles to defend Europe. But when the United States positions aircraft carriers in our hemisphere where we live, somehow that's a problem. So I would say that the United States and this president has made very clear, his job is to protect the United States from threats against the United States, and that is what he's doing in this operation.
Yeah, so I think Marco said it well. I completely agree with him. EU, mind your own business. Stay out of U.S. security affairs here in the Western Hemisphere. You don't get to tell the U.S. what to do with its military and then also beg the U.S. to keep protecting you. Can't have it both ways. And a lot of Americans want the U.S. to pull out of Europe and stop defending Europe. Let Europe fight its own wars. And again, if the EU and the UN don't like what the U.S. is doing, then sanction the U.S. Do it if you can. I doubt you can.
UN, you have a problem with that? You know what you should do? You should sanction me. Sanction me with your army. Oh, wait a minute. You don't have an army. I guess that means you need to shut the fuck up. That's what I do if I don't have no army. I would fuck up. Shut the fuck up. That's right.
since the way the UN is structured, the U.S. would have to approve any such sanction. It's not going to happen. And since the U.S. is not a signatory to the International Criminal Court, you can't sanction us through that body. But if there's another court that does have jurisdiction in this matter over the U.S., then I say bring it. Perhaps that'll be enough to get the U.S. to pull troops out of the EU and Britain, and maybe even leave the UN. A lot of Americans think the UN is a complete waste of money. I believe the U.S. is by far the highest source of funding for the UN. A lot of countries in the UN are not our allies and don't like the US, so why should we continue to fund said organizations that don't like America? So like I said in my video yesterday, telling the US how to use its military, cutting off intelligence if it's true that it did happen, Trump might take his toys and go home. The EU might not get those Tomahawk missiles that are nuclear capable. Then what would you do? If you want good relations with the US, EU, UK, you need to show a little more gratitude. Hey, let me know what I got right or wrong. If you like this, like and subscribe. If you don't watch it. Thanks. Bye.